Defending Israel with David Harris on JBS is made possible in part by Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Paul and Lynn Late Family Foundation to Life to Love, and the Patricia Worthen Allman Foundation.
Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris, and this is Defending Israel. I'm thrilled that this week's guest is an award-winning investigative journalist, David Collier, speaking to us from London. And more than being an award-winning journalist, David is, I would say, a dragon slayer, and we'll explain why in the ensuing interview. David, welcome to Defending Israel.
Hi, David. Thanks for inviting me on.
It's a great pleasure. So my first question, David, is, though you can't tell from my accent, I spent a number of years in British higher education. And during those years, particularly in the 1970s, the BBC was my place to go for information, whether it was BBC Radio, BBC Television, BBC World Service. Was I simply being naive and failing to understand what I was listening to then? Because I thought it was the gold standard. Today, you have helped the world understand that the BBC is not what we all once thought it was. So what happened?
Well, plenty happened in those 40 or 50 years, and sadly, most of it not for the good. You're right. I mean, going back in time, the BBC was the gold standard. In many ways, what's happening at the BBC is reflective of what's happening in wider society in Europe. So it's not really just the BBC. The issue with the BBC, of course, is that it's a publicly funded body. It's a state broadcaster, which means it's spending public money. For the last, 2 or 3 decades, it's basically been employing journalists who are either of the hard left, progressives, or Islamists. And it's been using Al Jazeera, the Qatari mouthpiece, as a recruiting pool. And at a certain point, if you continually employ these people, then this is effectively what you will start to put out yourself.
So most recently, you have been pointing the finger at, very publicly and very credibly, about a BBC documentary on Gaza. Can you tell our viewers, especially those in the United States who may not know the story, what the story is and why you were so concerned about it?
Okay. Look, I've been following media reporting on Israel now for decades, and we've seen it get worse and worse. And we've certainly since October the 7th, we know that the media across the globe has been pushing out Hamas propaganda. Basically, many of our mainstream, legacy media outlets have become Hamas puppets. The issue it's very difficult to prove, because even though we all know that nothing gets out of Gaza unless Hamas wants it to, when you have a media outlet just pushing a camera in front of someone, it looks very real. What the BBC did, they effectively ran a documentary showing the lives of children living in Gaza through the conflict. And this time we really got them, because one of the children that they had used was the son of a Hamas official, a senior Hamas official from Gaza. And it's the level here of complicity, effectively, that left them with no excuses and nowhere to hide.
So what happened as a result? Did they pull the documentary? Did they acknowledge their errors?
Well, I mean, the documentary went out. It went out, one Monday evening, and I started to look at the documentary straight away. It only took me a few hours. I realized there were problems quite quickly. I didn't sleep that night. I was digging away, trying to get to the bottom of the identity. By 7 o'clock the following morning, I had nailed it. So I published on X thread and on my own website, laying out exactly the evidence that I found. And in the beginning, they started backtracking. They weren't sure what to do, because they didn't actually seem to know what was going on themselves. It took them several hours to realize that I'd got it right, that they'd actually been caught in bed with a prescribed terrorist group. It took about 2 or 3 days actually of them umming and ahhing before they realized that they were in a corner, and they took it down.
So, David, back to the bigger picture. You said, and for many American viewers this may be news, that the BBC is a publicly funded, government-connected institution. How does it get away with propagandizing in this way, with its irresponsible journalism, when, if I may say so, an independent journalist like yourself, without a massive bureaucracy to support you, within a few hours comes up with all of the fake news, the errors, the misreporting, the misrepresentation that the BBC, this vaunted institution, was unwilling or unable to come up with?
Look, it's a complicated situation. There's arisen what people refer to as a community of the good. We can look at it in organizations like the BBC. I would imagine there are several outlets in the US that operate this way as well, where they operate within their own bubble. They consider the people within that bubble to be good people, and everyone outside of it to be extreme or fascist or racist or whatever else they want to smear them with. So you're in a situation where they're in an echo chamber, and they don't really consider what's taking place outside of that echo chamber because they've rejected it. So the BBC can then internally push through the idea for this documentary. They'll seek people from within their own bubble, within their own community of the good, to put it together, and they won't question them because they're in the community of the good. So why would they lie? Why would they promote Hamas propaganda? And it's a major issue we see not just with the BBC. I know we're focusing on the BBC because it is state funded, but with all media, or most of it, that has been producing absolute trash and demonizing Israel for far longer than October the 7th, but certainly since October the 7th. And we see it every day. We see these people in front of the camera every day, and nobody questions them. And they're just churning it out. It's like a factory. It really is like a factory.
But because it's government connected, isn't there a measure of public accountability? Where have the governments, not just the Keir Starmer government of today, but the previous governments which were Tory-led, where were they? What power do they have to oversee the BBC and potentially to intervene?
This is actually why this latest finding is so important. We've had this problem for decades now. The BBC marks its own exam paper, whereas we have organizations that are set up to check, Ofcom it's called here, to check up media broadcasting. The BBC sits outside of that. It's state funded, it was created by statute, it's governed by statute. So everything it does is basically following laws that it itself has created. It will, and I have done, I've registered complaints with the BBC. You end up in some circular waste of time and waste of space where they're marking their own paper. They say everything's okay. It's very difficult to get them to move. And everything has been going on like this for decades. In fact, there was an investigation into their bias in the early 2000s that was never made public. We don't actually know what it contained. So given that environment, what has happened here is the BBC has been so badly exposed by this. I mean, actually caught in bed with Hamas, actually just effectively turning itself into a Hamas puppet and spending hundreds of thousands of pounds of license fee money, public money, on doing so. So there is now extreme pressure from many areas in politics for an independent investigation to find out exactly how toxic and how corrupt the BBC has become.
And one more question on the BBC before we go elsewhere in the UK. The BBC has an Arabic language service. I remember in my years in Britain, I was interested in Russia, and I followed very closely the BBC's Russian language service, which was a great lifeline to people behind the Iron Curtain. Talk to us about the British BBC Arabic language service and whether it plays the same role different, worse, or better?
But they're actually, I think, a primary cause. If you, and we'll use your Russian example because I think it's a very good one. Most of the people that spoke Russian that the BBC would have been using at the time would have been dissidents. So the reporting would have been quite critical of the Soviets, and you would have had people
Yes.
trying to find out the truth of what was actually taking place. Here it's very different because the BBC is relying on people who are not dissidents, but rather supporters of Jordan, of Iraq, of Syria, of Egypt, or all of these, states in the Middle East. And any journalist in the UK who's not an Arab will probably need an Arab to help him with the translation of material, with finding the witnesses, with knowing who to talk to, with finding the runners and the fixers, which means the BBC has a major agency problem in that most non-Arabic speakers will be completely dependent on Arabic speakers to bring out news from the Middle East. And that creates basically the situation we're in today. And and it's important, this is where it's not just the BBC, it's everywhere.
So let's go beyond the BBC, David, in the next few minutes. Another one of the issues that you focused on your on X, on Twitter, and I would encourage all JBS viewers to follow David Collier on Twitter. David, tell our viewers what your X Twitter account name is.
It's Mishtal, Mishtal.
Mishtal. Okay, so you focused on the Royal Television Society as another illustration of problems we have in the media. First of all, what is the Royal Television Society for non-British viewers, and what was the problem?
Well, the Royal Television, it's a body in the United Kingdom that's set up to, as a society for television generally. I mean, it's no different from like the Oscar givers and the BAFTAs, and they give awards out. They give prizes for quality television or quality news giving. And they recently held awards for the news. And Gaza, they were overrun with nominations for Gaza, whether it was documentaries or whether it was news broadcasts. It was all about Gaza, Gaza, Gaza. Nothing, of course, on anywhere else like the Sudan or Congo, or it's all about Gaza. And they picked up on one girl. She's an Al Jazeera journalist, of course, and she's atrocious. I mean, we're talking about a girl that is publicly associated with Islamic Jihad terrorists. Two things of note. And remember, this is somebody who a television society wanted to give an award for news gathering.
Could I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes, of course you can.
In Britain, when the word royal is used, does it require official approval to use the word royal?
Yes.
Or can anyone simply use the word?
No, it's again governed by statute. You would only be allowed to use that if you have some kind of royal charter. You're given the permission by the royal family to use that name. Otherwise, you can't touch it.
In other words, the Royal Television Society is not just another group. It has the imprimatur of the monarch, of the royal family.
For sure. And talking about this particular journalist, there were two things that I think I want to list in detail because I think they describe everything. The first was she actually snitched up a human rights activist. There was a Zoom call that took place between a Gazan and some left-wing Israelis about peace and creating peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. She was so horrified by it, she posted, it was Twitter then, so she tweeted out about this event, calling him all the names under the sun and tagging in Hamas officials, basically telling the Hamas officials they needed to deal with it. And the Hamas officials arrested him. So this journalist actually had someone arrested by Hamas for wanting to pursue peace. And another post she did, this she reposted, it was during the 2021 conflict, where someone had basically said, look, we need to self-censor. We need to protect the resistance, Hamas. We need to make sure that what we say doesn't hurt Hamas. We need to be careful about what we're saying. Basically saying, look, we need to lie and we need to protect Hamas. So if we're posting, we need to make sure we don't do anything that would hurt Hamas. She reposted that. How can anybody ever call her a journalist? She's openly admitting she's a blind propagandist for radical Islamic terrorist organizations.
And again, remind the viewers, and the Royal Television Society did what with her?
They nominated her for an award as an up-and-coming young journalist. But again, an additional point, even knowing all that, Al Jazeera employed her as a journalist. You know, we need to get to the bottom of what's taking place in media, because Al Jazeera, whether we like it or not, is respected in some quarters. Al Jazeera was actually up for one of the awards. So we're in a position where we're losing quality across the board with these journalists, and what they are is they are spreading the lies of radical Islamic terrorist organizations.
Another British media outlet that has a lot of reach in the United States is The Guardian, the newspaper, and its website, according to the numbers, reaches millions upon millions of users each and every month, including here in the United States. Talk to us for a few moments about your experience with The Guardian and what our viewers should know about it.
The Guardian it's from the same part of the spectrum or mindset as the BBC. They're basically akin. They're brothers in arms. It's got that leftist, hard leftist spin to it. It aligns itself with the Islamists. It considers itself, again, part of the community of the good. They actually came after me, The Guardian, several years ago, because I'd written a report on Amnesty International, which is another NGO that has lost its way, spends all its time just demonizing Israel. And The Guardian came after me because of that. They tried to create some kind of conspiracy theory as if I was being paid by some secret Israeli organization or something like this. They're pit bulls, they're guard dogs for this hard left, progressive, anti-Israel vision. And they will go after people that try to stick up for the state of Israel.
And for our viewers, are you part of an organization, or are we looking at the organization? Are you a one-person operation?
Yeah, David, this is just me. There's me, a keyboard, and a determination to cause trouble where trouble needs to be caused.
Another British media outlet that gets global reach is Sky News. What's been your experience with Sky News?
They all employ people from the same bubble. If you actually look, and it's something I'm actually working on to try to see how incestuous these relationships are. These journalists that go between them, they go from Sky or The Guardian or BBC or ITV or Al Jazeera. It's all part and parcel of the same problem. We cannot trust the media and the news they're giving. I can't stress it. You know, as someone that looks at it closely, I have not seen a single article, not one, come out of these organizations where I would say that has been written fairly, because the motivations behind the articles are toxic, which means the output is always going to be bad.
And David, if we can shift gears from British media to British higher education, of which I am one product, you focused quite a bit on one of my alma maters, the London School of Economics, and a recent book that they promoted at LSE regarding Hamas. So we're talking about a virus that includes but goes well beyond the media, are we not, in Britain?
Well, I think, yes, but I think it's the other way around. The problem is that our universities are churning out the people that then go into politics, into media and everything else. This is the problem. Starts in the schools. It's in the education. We have, even at the teacher level, forget the universities, the teacher level, you know, with the teaching unions, horrific anti-Israel, it's pro-Palestinian anti-Israel propaganda just churned out all the time. In university campuses, Jewish students are often scared to identify as Jews. That's the situation. and it's been that way for quite a while. And of course, the people that are being brainwashed, and radicalized on campus, then go on to work in the media. They work in museum spaces. They work in politics, and this is creating what we're seeing in society.
So when I went to LSE as a graduate student, we euphemistically referred to it as the London School of Economics because there were a number of Jews, and we were actually quite comfortable at the time being both Jews and full students at LSE. What happened recently that caught your attention at the London School of Economics?
Well, I mean, firstly, the situation, I mean, if you were here in the 1970s, this is a very different country. The demographics here have changed, dramatically. We now have a very large and growing Muslim community. Most of the students on our London campuses are foreign students. There's a book called Understanding Hamas. And I've read the book. I bought it. It came out last September. Why they're calling this recent event a book launch, I don't know. But they have held a book launch on campus for this book called Understanding Hamas, which legitimizes a prescribed radical Islamic terrorist group.
Proscribed, meaning under British law, Hamas is designated a terror organization. But it did not deter the London School of Economics from hosting the event.
No, they come out. I mean, look, the universities have to be quite careful because, of course, free speech is a very important thing. I mean, you're Americans, you know this.
Right. But it doesn't obligate universities to publicize everything, David.
No, for sure not. No, of course not. I'm not defending. I'm just saying that.
No, I understand. But
we're dealing with something that it's not. We have to say, okay, there should be some leeway. But when it comes to something like this, they've clearly crossed lines. There's no argument here. We're not even, the British law prescribed Hamas the military arm. We played this game for about 2 decades, where we prescribed the military arm, but not the rest of the terrorist organization. A few years ago, that stupid error was corrected. The same with Hezbollah, and the entire organization was prescribed. So this is legally seen as a terror group, and this university is holding an event to basically normalize, accommodate, and understand that terror group.
David, we have just a few minutes left. I've got another 100 questions, but there was a great deal of concern, particularly as long as Jeremy Corbyn led the Labour Party, including in a national election. He was then ousted as the leader of the party. Keir Starmer took over with promises to clean up the party. He is now the Prime Minister. I'm speaking as a non-partisan and certainly in a British context. Would you say, as a Brit, that the Labour Party has been, if you will, cleaned or purged of the Corbynista element in the party?
No. Look, firstly, we have to give credit where it's due, that there's been some improvement. But the problem is societal. It's not tied into a particular party. What happened is a group or a part of the spectrum in our society took control of the Labour Party with Jeremy Corbyn between 2015 and 2019. But that part of the spectrum still exists. It's large, it's growing. Keir Starmer he's got problems trying to walk this fence. He probably is quite a nice guy, but he doesn't really have the people behind him, the public behind him. He was quite fortunate in the last election. I won't go into detail in the way that it worked out to get a majority far bigger than he deserved. But it's not going to hold. And the problems that led to Corbyn are going to come back, and they're going to be worse. That's the issue here. We will have bigger problems than we have with Corbyn. When I going through the Corbyn years, and I was obviously one of those fighting him daily, I thought it was as bad as it could get. I had no idea what was coming around the corner.
So let me ask you very bluntly a question that I know is on the minds of many. Effectively, given all that you say, the trends, demographic and other, is Britain essentially lost? Is there a future for not just the Britain as we know it, but also for the Jewish community to live freely and openly as it has for so many years?
David, you're talking to a pessimist. I'm up fighting this every day. So we have to bear in mind that my vision may be somewhat, skewed, but looking at everything that's taking place on the ground, and it's not just England, it's not just the UK, it's Europe as a whole. Europe is in serious trouble. And unless I don't want to say lost, because, yes, I feel we're on the Titanic and I think the ship is sinking. But there's always opportunities to turn it around, but it would need drastic, brave politicians to come in and do what needs to be done. And sadly, I just don't see any on the horizon.
But what's happening instead, David, it seems, is that it's fueling the extreme right wing, and not just in Britain, but also in Britain, because the extreme right wing makes the claim that the establishment has not addressed the problem, therefore they represent the only alternative, and they may be opposed to the trends you're talking about, but they're also not supportive of the values that we have depended upon to live in democratic societies as free citizens and as free Jews.
Yeah, this is where you're talking to the pessimist in me. I look at a situation, a societal situation where it's going to spiral, and exactly because of the points you raise, we're ending up with large. I mean, there are always some people in any society that are disenfranchised. Always. The trouble really sets in when those people become large blocks, and what we have on all sides, a growing number of people who are disenfranchised. And you will start to see, I believe, the growth of a far right here. I think terrorism is not out of the question. The reaction to that because their targets will mainly be Muslim people, not just the Islamists, not just the politicized, but just anybody. That will drive a spike in the rise of Islamist groups that are going to try to counter them. So I see it as a spiral with each feeding on each other, and I don't know how it's going to stop. That's as I said, that's a pessimist talking.
And I would just add for JBS viewers that about 30 years ago, David, I recall being in Tunisia, meeting with government leaders in Tunisia who were saying even then, 30 years ago to us, how do we stop London and Washington from welcoming jihadists who threaten our society, whom we seek to expel from Tunisia, and whom Britain and the United States give a home to? Fast forward 30 years, and a UAE official recently said that of the 16 or 17 proscribed Islamist organizations in the UAE, I believe half, he said, are headquartered in Britain. Is that a formula for future success?
No, it's not, and it's a very accurate description of what's taking place. I think half of the countries in the Middle East think that Europe is crazy. I really do. What's taking place here, we can't get prescription over the line, and even when we do, and we have the examples of Hamas and Hezbollah, it's okay to prescribe a group, but then you have to take action. The law has to have teeth. And all they seem to do is prescribe it in name only. But people are walking around supporting Hamas and nothing happens to them.
And carrying flags.
Yeah, for sure. Carrying, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas. So we have a police force. I mean, we had people out on the streets calling for jihad, and we had the police trying to pretend it was some kind of, peaceful, spiritual growth event. I mean, unless you really try to tackle it, you're not going to be able to deal with it. And the problem is we've let it go so far. I think it's far easier for these bodies to pretend everything's okay, because if they wake up to the reality of where they are, it's going to be a really scary place for them to be.
David, I want to thank you for being on the program, and especially for your courage and principle in trying to bring the world's attention to these issues before it's too late. Again, JBS viewers, this is David Collier, award-winning investigative journalist in Britain, frequent voice on X, someone that all of us should be following. David, thank you so much.
David, thank you so much for having me on.